It's 2009. I'm having lunch with my best friend at a pizza place. This guy is one of the brightest lights I have ever seen in my life. He's one of those people who walks into a room. By the end, when he walks out, everybody thinks they're his best friend. He just had this heart that would shine on people. And he desperately, desperately wanted to change lives for a living. So he came to our NLP trainings, got certified as an NLP practitioner, hypnotherapist, master practitioner, NLP trainer. And I thought, man, this guy is going to soar. He's so dynamic. He's an extrovert. He's going to go out and talk to people, change lives everywhere. And 6 or 8 months in, he is struggling. He hasn't had a single paying client yet. He hasn't put on a course yet. Keeps telling me about all these problems, challenges, excuses, right? And so we're sitting there in the pizza place, and I'm kind of giving him the riot act. I'm saying, Eugene, you just need to get out there. You just need to follow the steps that I've told you, right? Step by step. I've told you exactly how to be successful. Step 1, step 2, step 3. Just do it. And he snapped. And he looked at me and he said, that's easy for you. Everything's always easy for you. Everything's always been easy for you. And I looked at him and I said, what? What do you mean? He goes, everything. You're just good at everything you do. Everything's always easy. You're like an overnight success. And I said, hang on a minute. We got to rewind here for a second. Now, mind you, this is my best friend, right? Your best friend is supposed to be the person who knows everything about you, sometimes even your darkest secrets. And my best friend didn't know anything about my past. I told him when I was born, my mom was 14 years old, never graduated junior high. She lied on every resume that she had, said she had a college degree, didn't even have a junior high degree. She had a vicious personality disorder called borderline personality disorder. It's one of the worst. When you have a parent with borderline personality disorder, your childhood is very, very difficult, right? I grew up with people calling Child Protective Services on us. We grew up in abject poverty. I lived in a little tiny single-wide trailer in Times Beach, Missouri. My mother and father together combined made less than $13,000 a year. And as bad as that was, when I was 9 years old, it got way worse. Remember we had an El Nino. It's the first El Nino we had, in 1982. First El Nino that ever happened. We had a historic flood, over 150 years of recorded history. Never had a flood this bad. It wiped out everything. Our trailer was 13 feet underwater from the roof for 3 weeks. And then Environmental Protection Agency came in, seized the entire town, and destroyed the town because of dioxin poisoning. Lost everything I owned at 9 years old. Turned into a troubled teen. Failed through high school. And at 19 years old, feeling the lowest that I'd ever felt in my life, ended up homeless for 6 months, sleeping on a park bench in Tustin, California. Right after I got off the streets, when I finally thought I would put my life back together, I started dating a girl. Interestingly enough, she had borderline personality disorder. How does that happen? The patterns we run in life. And she said 2 words I never thought I would hear from her because she told me they were impossible. She said, I'm pregnant. Right when I thought I was going to get my life back together, this thing came along and knocked me down again. And that was my first 20 years of my life. And as I'm saying this, my best friend, person who I'm closest to, who knew none of this, is staring back at me with his jaw, slack jaw. And he said 6 words to me that would change my life forever. It reminds me of a time when I was on stage, 2010. I'd been a speaker for a few years, but I'd always trained things like NLP, hypnotherapy. I'd never really been a general speaker. And I had a friend of mine who was putting on an event. He had about 40 people in the room. He invited me to come and speak, to sit for free in the audience. And I figured, I'm going to go and I'm going to be fully present. So I left my laptop at home, left my iPad at home. I just went me. For some reason, I dressed up in a suit and tie that day. I don't know why. But I was sitting there in the audience on the aisle row, and I feel a tap on my shoulder. I turn around, look back. It's my friend, A.G. Morshida. He runs the event. And he says, do you want to speak? I'm not meant to speak at this event. I'm just an attendee. I don't even have a laptop. But somebody told me once, stage time is wealth time. Anytime somebody offers you time on stage, you take it. So I looked at him and I said, sure, when do you want me to speak? He said, you're on in 15 minutes. Let's get you backstage right now so we can mic you up. I didn't have a PowerPoint. Didn't have notes. I didn't have an idea of what I was going to talk about. But I got on stage, I got into the flow, and something magical happened. For the first time ever, in the public, in front of other people, I told my story. My mom always told me growing up, don't tell people your sob story. Nobody wants to hear it. And I didn't realize how impactful that would be, because what happened in that room that day was magical. And it reminds me of years later, I got one of these internet radio shows. You know, now they call them podcasts, but back then we called them internet radio. And I had a guy that would run the music for me and take phone calls and all this. And I decided to start that show. It was all about success patterns. I decided to start that show by telling my story. And I had a friend who lived here in Vegas who knew me when I was homeless. He knew me in high school and when I was homeless. And Kayla and I came out to Vegas one day, and he said, hey, I want to have breakfast with you. I hadn't seen this guy in years. I thought, okay. So we go have breakfast. It's kind of weird. I hadn't seen him in like 20 years, but it was kind of like a connection. And Kayla got up to go take a phone call, and he said, I want to tell you something. He said, when I heard that you're doing this radio show, this Power to Create Your Life radio, and you're talking about success, you know what I thought? I'm thinking, oh, he's thinking, wow, Michael's really made it, or, good job. He goes, I thought you were full of shit. I said, excuse me? He goes, you talking about success? He goes, I know you. I know you, Mike, who I knew, homeless Mike at 19 years old, homeless on the streets. I thought, what the fuck do you know about success? But I thought I'd turn into your little stupid radio program and hear what you had to say. And then he began to well up in tears. The subconscious mind is such an interesting thing. This is what, for 24 years now, I've been studying the subconscious mind and the power of ethical influence and persuasion. And one of the most powerful things you could do is storytelling. A lot of what I want to talk about today comes from a guy named Milton H. Erickson. Milton Erickson was a psychologist, a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, one of the most famous in the world. People would send clients to him from all around the world because he could solve problems no other therapist could. And Milton became an amazing storyteller. And the reason was because he was working with schizophrenics, and schizophrenics are the most difficult patients to work with. They're the most resistant people that you can work with. He couldn't tell them how to change. He couldn't even use hypnosis on them, which was his primary tool. But he finally learned that if he told stories, he could actually make changes in their life. And one of Milton's favorite stories was about a student of his, a student named Arthur. Arthur was a student in college, and he was always taking these copious notes. And one day the professor said, hey, class, we're going to have a pop quiz today. I'm going to give you a quiz, and you don't know what it is because the quiz has been locked in my door. And Arthur goes, Professor, I know what your quiz is. He goes, your quiz is going to be 10 questions, and it's going to be these questions. He started naming off the questions in order. And as he did that, the professor got angry, blew up at him. He goes, go to the dean's office. You've been cheating. And he sent Arthur to the dean's office. Now, Arthur had been trained by Milton Erickson. He'd been trained to observe people, to watch the stories that people tell you through their physiology, through their language, their tone of voice. And when Arthur got into the dean's office, the dean came in and said, Arthur, why would you do this? You're an amazing student. Why would you cheat? And Arthur said, I haven't cheated, and I can prove it. Send somebody back to the class and bring my notebook in. And when they brought the notebook in, the dean opened it, and he looked inside, and what he saw was the most copious notes that he'd ever seen in his life. There were notes on every single line. There were notes in every margin. There were notes diagonal lines. And what he noticed that there was asterisks next to certain things. There were 1 asterisk, and some there were 2, and some there were 5, and 7, and 4, and 3. But only next to 10 lines were there 10 asterisks, and those were the 10 questions on the test. Milton would teach people how to observe other people, to find out what was going on with them, and then craft a story to match what they were going through. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, the power of storytelling. Why tell stories? I get a lot of people, they're like, I'm in business. Telling stories is like fairy tale stuff. That's what we do with kids. Why would I tell stories in my business? When I first started working with business owners and consulting business owners in 1998, I started talking about the power of hypnotic language, the power of storytelling, these kinds of things. And all these software developers are like, I can't do that. We can't have emotions in copy. That's bad, right? But here's the thing. Stories are engaging. We all were told stories when we were children by that person who was kind of like our personal Yoda, right? We all had a grandparent or a parent or someone like that who would tell us, maybe it was a teacher, who would tell us stories. And when we were told stories, we would just lose the outside world and become completely enthralled and become the character of the story. So not only are they engaging, they're also entertaining. Most important to us as marketers, when we tell stories, it brings people's guard down. So many of the things taught in sales course these days, people's guard come up because we've been conditioned to listen for sales language, right? But stories bring people's guards down. And here's the thing, no matter what you do, adding great purposeful storytelling will improve it. I don't care if it's sales, I don't care if it's influence, I don't care if it's parenting. I raised both of my kids on what we call hypnotic stories from the field of NLP, right, to help them overcome challenges. And if done correctly, telling stories completely bypasses the conscious mind, right? Now, why would we want to do that? Why would we want to bypass the conscious mind? It says here, facts tell, stories sell. We've heard this a million times, right? The reason for that is because the conscious mind only makes up about 6/1000th of 1%, but it's the most defensive part of the mind, right? The unconscious mind, by the way, is the more powerful part of the mind, the emotional, organic part of the mind, the part of the mind in charge of desire, which is most important for us when it comes to sales. That's 99.994%. That's the part of the mind we want to talk to get people to desire our product. But the conscious mind, it's like these guys that you see standing guard at the gate. Their job is to keep you out, right? And like these guys in London, for the most part, most of the time, they don't even want to talk to you. Conscious mind just wants to ignore you and reject everything you say, especially in a sales situation, right? So the hardest thing a salesperson has to do is get behind this guard and speak to the most important decision maker, which, in England now is the king, right? When it comes to desire, the subconscious mind is king or queen. We got to get past that gate. Accessing and communicating with the subconscious mind is the key to great marketing and sales. So here's the thing. The problem is, because a lot of us have been told to tell stories, and so we put stories, we weave them into our copy, we put them in our sales pitches. The problem is, if your story is too obvious, it gets rejected by the conscious mind. So we have to use stories that occupy or confuse the conscious mind, that guard at the gate, so that we can communicate to the subconscious mind, right? And that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give you a mechanism, an actual formula for knowing the right story to tell every time. To teach you how to be a great storyteller, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you how to think like a genius. Who wants to think like a genius? Yeah? This is great. I think everybody's a genius. I know there are these people that say, oh, you were born a genius. Maybe. I don't know. But all I know is this. In NLP, we're a field of modelers. We model excellence. If a genius thinks in a certain way, and I teach somebody who's not a, quote, genius to think in that way, are they not a genius? That's the way I see it. Right? So great storytelling really comes down to this pattern. This pattern is what we like to call thinking levels, right? Now, everybody thinks at a particular chunk level. Are you a big picture thinker or a detailed thinker? How many people in the room are big picture thinkers? That's a little bit more than usual, right? Across the population, it's generally only about 15% of people are big picture, or what in Myers-Briggs is called intuitor, right? How many people are detailed thinkers? Good. Right? So on the Myers-Briggs MTBI, right, Myers-Briggs type indicator, we're talking about the difference between a big picture thinker and a detailed thinker, an intuitor and a sensor. Intuitors like big pictures, ideas, concepts, and connections, while sensors like details, facts, and concrete evidence. Okay? Now, this is not a polar thing. It's not like a light switch where you're either one or the other. There's actually kind of a big spectrum between the two. But most people tend to fall into one of these two camps, right? So probably what will happen is one of these will be easier for you than the other in thinking in levels, right? Now, again, almost an infinite range, but most people kind of get stuck at the level they're at. The people with the highest level of genius in the world are the people who are able to walk up and down this ladder. You look at people, modern geniuses like Steve Jobs, right? Steve Jobs could be a big picture thinker. He could also get into the details. You look at somebody like Walt Disney. Walt's brother said that you never knew which Walt was going to show up, whether it was the job site or the office or whatever. Sometimes he would show up and he'd be this big visionary dreamer, and other times he'd show up with a hammer and he would work on the actual mechanical equipment at the park, right? He was one of the few people that could really move up and down this ladder very easily. And unfortunately, we have very few people in the world who can walk up and down that ladder, right? Most people are just stuck the way that they think. So knowing which story to choose actually comes down to this pattern right here. And it works like this. Oh, but I love this quote from Albert Einstein, by the way. You cannot solve a problem at the same level of thinking that created the problem. The reason why most people get stuck is because they're stuck at their level of thinking. If you know how to change your level of thinking, you can solve any problem in the world. And this is for 23 years now, I've been a coach. And this is how I solve almost all my clients' problems when they come to me. I help them solve their problems by moving them up and down this ladder. So here's how it works. I'm going to teach you this kind of mechanical part here first, and then I'm going to show you how to create stories from it. So in order to change your chunk level of thought, if we start with a concept like a car, okay, we can go bigger picture on a car, we can go more detail on a car. Most people don't know how to do that, but there's a really simple way. You just ask questions. You ask yourself some questions. If I want to go bigger picture from car, one of the questions I can ask myself is, what is car an example of? So let's play a game. What is car an example of? Vehicle, transportation. Yeah, what else? Freedom. That's a big chunk, yeah. What else? Status, right? Now, all of these answers are correct, okay? As long as you ask the right question, what's car an example of, you're always going to go to a bigger picture. This is how people like Steve Jobs could go to bigger picture ideas and come up with these magnificent ideas like an iPod and an iPad and things like that. And by the way, Steve Jobs came up with the idea for the iPad in 1982. Wow. There's a video of it. Fantastic. All the AI stuff that we're having right now is finally catching up to his vision in 1982 because he knew how to ask these kind of questions. Questions that other CEOs of companies, technology companies, couldn't ask. A second question, by the way, let's take car and chunk it up. What is car an example of? One answer for that is transportation. It's not the only answer, right? Status is another answer, vehicle is another answer, but transportation. A second question you can ask to chunk up to a bigger level is, for what purpose? For what purpose do we have transportation? Travel, yeah, get from one place to another. What other purpose? Convenience, what else? For what purpose? What's that? Get away from your in-laws, right? Fun, right? These status, again, yeah, these are all great answers. There's no right answer as long as you're following the question. So, and then the third question you can ask is, for what intention? So for what purpose do we transport? For movement, so we can move. That's just one possible answer, but it's a right answer. And then what is the intention of movement? Freedom. Yeah, see, I told you chunked up big, right? Yeah, that was a big chunk up. What else?
To travel.
Get shit done, right? To arrive. All of those. We could chunk up as high as we could go, right? I mean, this is a big chunk. To exist. We wouldn't exist if we didn't move. So these are all examples of chunking up. Now notice, one of the things to notice when I go from transportation, how would we know that's a bigger chunk level? Because there are a lot more things that are transportation than just cars. Does this make sense? Yeah. Okay. So we learned how to chunk up. Now let's learn how to chunk down. It's pretty simple. A couple of questions we can ask ourselves. We can chunk a car down into classes and categories. For example, we could say, what is an example of a car? SUV. An SUV? Yep. Sports car? What else? Truck? Sedan. Ford? Purse. A purse? Oh, a hearse. Oh, yeah. I was going to say.
I love lamb.
Yeah, purse is a stretch, but hearse, yes, a hearse.
Lamb.
Right? Those are all a way to chunk down, right? So when we say, what is an example of this, right, we could go to Tesla. Tesla is a chunk down from a car. It's a more specific version of a car. We could also say, what specifically? That's another question we can ask. What specific kind of a Tesla? Well, a Tesla Model S. Which specific Tesla model is 2024, right? Does this make sense? So now we're going down into more specifics. But this may seem simple. This is a pattern that most people do not know how to use in their lives, right? And I'll show you how to use it. We can also, by the way, chunk a car down into its components, right? So if we start a car and go, what are components of a car? Brake pads, right? We could go suspension, engine, right? We could go air, fuel, water. There are all kinds of ways we could chunk down. Suspension, wheel, lug nuts, right? One of the smallest pieces you can have in a car. So we can go all the way down to the most specific thing on a car, just by asking our own self some simple questions. What are components of this and what specifically? Okay. So far, really simple, correct? Again, so simple, most people don't know how to do it. Here's where the real genius pattern comes in. I'm telling you, when you have this light bulb come on, you're going to realize that you can use this in so many places, in marketing, in sales, in everything, in solving problems, coaching, everything. Here's kind of the full picture of, we started at car. We can go all the way up to existence. We can go all the way down to the smallest lug nut. Okay. Here's the real genius pattern. It's called lateral chunking. This is so powerful, by the way. There was a guy in the 1980s named Edward de Bono. Anybody remember him? He wrote a book called Lateral Thinking. It was a #1 best-selling book on the New York Times bestsellers. He was for like weeks and months. Had this amazing book talking about how all the greatest companies in the world were the greatest companies because they thought laterally. Book was such a bestseller, he wrote a second book a follow-up book to it. Do you know what he didn't teach in his book? How to lateral think. He admitted it himself. He didn't know how to teach it. He just knew how to identify that that's where all great ideas came from, was lateral thinking. So he tried to inspire people, but there was no method for it. This is it. This is exactly how you lateral think. If we start with car and I want to lateral think to something else, it's a two-step process, and you already know both steps. First question is this: what is car an example of? Okay, we can chunk up to transportation. The second question, once we chunk up, we're going to chunk down to something else. What's another example of transportation? Boats, right? Trains, buses, planes, right? All of these are a lateral chunk, okay? Now notice these are all really, really closely related to cars. Matter of fact, most of these have wheels, right? So it's pretty easy. By the way, there used to be a game show on TV, right? Remember where was it called Pyramid? Where they would give you two things and you have to figure out how they're related, right? Kind of the opposite of this, the inverse. $20,000 pyramid, right? Now, the reason why these are all so closely related together is because we only chunked up a little bit. We went from car to transportation. What happens if we chunk up higher than that? What if we go from car to movement, right? What we come up with is not going to be as logically connected. What else moves? The earth moves, caterpillar moves, toddlers move, blood moves. Would you ever think that blood and car are related? Bowels move, yes. Would you ever think that blood and car are related? Would you ever think that a toddler and a car are related? See, most people in the world wouldn't think those two things are related, but you know what geniuses do? They see the connection in everything. Steve Jobs was a genius because he could see the connections that other people couldn't see. This was the pattern that he was running unconsciously. Walt Disney, Michelangelo, all the greatest, Hedy Lamarr, all the greatest geniuses do this pattern. What if we take that and chunk it up even higher? What if we go from car to, and be careful doing this, by the way, because what if we go from car to existence, right? Because what you find out is that a pancake is related to a car, and a flower is like a car, and everything at 42, all of it's like a car, right? So we chunk up too high, we get a little harebrained, right? So you got to be careful how high you chunk up. But what happens is when we chunk up, we can start to find things that are related that are not necessarily obviously conscious, or consciously obvious, I should say. And this is how we pick stories that bypass the conscious mind and go into the subconscious mind. Okay? So, for example, I heard, everybody knows Roy Williams, right? One of the greatest copywriters on earth. I heard Roy recite a poem once, and I wish I could remember the exact poem, but it was something about a man on a ship in the ocean, and he rides his steel, rides his steel mare back to the corral. We hear poems like this all the time with symbology in it, and a lot of times, like, how did they come up with that symbology? Is a horse a car, or is a boat a horse? It is in this poem, and the poem is more powerful because it doesn't refer to the ship itself. It refers to it as a horse, right? So how is a ship and a horse related? Well, now you know how to connect the dots, right? A horse is transportation. What's another form of transportation? A ship. This is how people put symbology in books and music and poems, right? Metaphor. We could also connect the dots, right? The horse runs. What does the ship do? The ship sails. So not only the thing can we lateral chunk over, we can also lateral chunk over the action, right? We could also lateral chunk the challenge, right? The horse is in a tornado. Tornado is an example of weather. What does a ship go through? That's called a hurricane. Notice how all these things in the poem, they all match over. They all map over, right? Even the outcomes. The horse goes back to the corral. What is the corral an example of? It's an example of safety. What is an example of safety for a ship? Back to port. Does this make sense? Okay. Now let's tie it all together, right? The horse running through a tornado back to the corral is analogous to a ship sailing through a hurricane back to port. Two stories that say the same thing, but not obviously the same thing consciously. Does this make sense? Now let's start tying this into storytelling. And by the way, notice how each element of that story was mapped across. It's the horse, it's the ship, the water, the corral, all of that stuff. Here's another great one that I love. I'm a cowboy on a steel horse I ride, right? What is the steel horse in Wanted Dead or Alive? It's a motorcycle, right? He's riding a motorcycle. He's a modern-day cowboy, not an old cowboy on a horse, but a modern-day cowboy on a steel horse, okay? So how about this? Listen to this description here. In a world on the brink of darkness, I'll do my best movie guy voice. In a world on the brink of darkness, rides A hero rides from the humble beginnings, destined to confront an ancient evil that threatens to consume all. Guided by a wise mentor and joined by a band of loyal companions, they must embark on a perilous journey through treacherous lands where every step tests their courage and resolve. Along the way, they will face the forces of tyranny, uncover long-lost secrets, and grapple with the burden of immense power as they struggle to determine their true path and fulfill their destiny to restore balance to a fractured world. Which story is this description about? Is it Luke, Meg, Frodo, Katniss, Harry, Moana, Neo? It's actually all of them, right? The thing that ties all these stories together, why do we love Rocky? You know, Rocky's a movie about boxing. I remember the first time I watched Rocky, I didn't care about boxing at all. I'm not much of a boxer. I like UFC, but I don't like boxing, right? But I loved Rocky. Why do we love Rocky? Why is Rocky inspirational? If you're not a boxer, and if you're not a fan of boxing, why would you love the movie Rocky? It's because Rocky represents you. Adrian represents your family. The fight represents the challenges that you're going through in your life or that you've been through in your life. The ring, or Drago, represents the enemy. The ring represents your environment. Rocky is your journey. The reason it inspires you is because it connects with you on a deep subconscious level through this lateral chunking process. Who is Rocky? Rocky's a person. Who's another person? You are. Right? All of these things, and every inspirational story that you've ever heard that's inspired you, that's moved you, even things to move you to take action, they all come from this process, right? At the unconscious level, Rocky's win is your win, and that's what makes us get so emotional at the end of the movie. It's the same reason we love Luke Skywalker, Meg Murray, Frodo Baggins, Katniss Everdeen, Harry Potter, Moana, Thomas Anderson. Anybody know who that is? Neo, yes. Dorothy Gale. Practically every Disney character that's ever been created. Disney's mastered this formula, right? And the formula, by the way, is called the hero's journey. Now, the hero's journey, you could take whole classes on, a giant class. I'm going to simplify it for you. It's really simple. In the hero's journey, every great story, all the way back to the Iliad and the Odyssey, thousands of years ago, follows this pattern. The hero starts off in a place of peace, joy, and ultimately wholeness, right? When we find them, they're in their home, their village, their shire, whatever it is, where they are. They start from a place of wholeness. And then there comes, now what are the marketers going to call this? Call to action. In the hero's journey, it's a call to adventure. When was the last time you had adventure in your life? Better question, when was the last time your customers had an adventure in their life? They need a call to adventure in their life. Very often, this call to adventure is accompanied by a wizard or some sort of a shaman or a wise person. You're that wise person in the story. They just don't know it yet. And then what happens is they come across challenges, trials and tribulations. Eventually, through sheer will and learning, they triumph over those trials and tribulations, and then they come back to a place of wholeness. But here's the interesting thing about the hero's journey that's never taught. I've never heard anybody teach this. It's always taught as a circle. It's not a circle. The hero's journey is not a circle. You need to tilt it at a 45-degree angle and look at it because the hero always levels up. They never come back to where they were in the story. They always come back better. This is the part a lot of people miss in the hero's journey, right? When you are telling stories to your clients, whether it's through copy, whether it's through over Zoom on a sales pitch, whether it's speaking from stage, they will assume the role of the hero in your story. And if you want your clients to overcome their sales objections, to overcome their challenges at home, like my spouse won't let me, things like that, right? You don't tell a story that brings them back to where they were. You tell a story that levels them up at an unconscious level. And that story ultimately they don't even consciously realize why you're telling the story, right? The best stories are the ones they don't consciously realize, right? The stories you tell should typically be about them leveling up because the subconscious mind takes everything personally. This is one of the key things about the subconscious mind. Your subconscious mind is like a 7-year-old, right? And like most 7-year-olds, it's selfish. Not in a bad way, right? But it's selfish. It thinks that everything is about itself. This is why if you hear somebody talking, you go, are they talking about me, right? The unconscious mind thinks everything is about self. And then we take that and project it back out onto the world. So when you tell a great story with a character in it, they are experiencing that story first person in their head as if they are that character. That's why, you ever listen to Les Brown? One of my favorite speakers of all time. All Les does is get up and tell stories on stage. And he makes, when he speaks internationally, $130,000 for 90 minutes of telling stories. And he has millions of people that he's changed their life through stories. That's how powerful it is. You ever heard of Jack Canfield, Mark Victor Hansen? They have the only, that I know of, billion-dollar book series, Chicken Soup for the Soul. They've earned $1 billion by sharing stories. Every time a person reads one of those stories, they are that person in the story. It connects with them. It changes their life. Why? Because the person in the story's life changed. And certain stories resonate with us and some don't. That's why you want to tell a lot of stories, especially if you're in front of a mixed audience. You want to tell many stories so that you connect with as many people in the audience. So the key to great storytelling is this. Number one, have a purpose. Some people just love to tell stories. We all know those people, right? Where you just can't get them to shut up. Oh, here comes another story from Bob. Oh my God, right? You don't just want to tell stories for the purpose of telling stories. There should be a real purpose for it. When I'm on stage and I'm telling stories on stage, my purpose is to inspire someone to take the next step. Where's the next step? It's at the back table, right? If I'm on a webinar, my purpose is to inspire them to click that button at the end of the webinar, overcome the fears that they have, and pull out a credit card and put money down for the thing that I'm offering them. If I'm talking to my kids, my job is to inspire them to make the right choices in their life without them consciously knowing that I'm telling them to make those choices. I don't know if you remember this, but anybody ever watch He-Man? I freaking loved He-Man when I was a kid. And for like 3 seasons, I watched every single He-Man episode there was until there was this weird format change that they had. And it was like 4th season, I think it was. And so instead of a half an hour show, they'd do 20 minutes and they'd come back from the break and they go, all the characters would come in from the side and go, here's the moral of the story. And they would tell you what the whole episode you watched, that had all these great messages in it, they would tell you, like, this is about, He-Man's telling you don't do drugs. He-Man's saying don't slap your hoe. He-Man's saying, like, whatever it is, right? There's some moral that was already there in the story influencing you, but then they made it conscious. And He-Man got lame. Very quickly after that, I stopped watching, right? So we want to make sure that it has a purpose, but the best purpose is to move people from one state to another. We'll talk about this more in a minute. Changing states. Anybody know Joe Vitale? The hypnotic marketer, right? Long before he was in The Secret, he was the hypnotic marketer. He was one of us before he was in The Secret. Joe Vitale wrote a book years ago, probably 25 years ago, called Buying Trances. I definitely recommend you read it. In the book, Joe said people will not buy what you're selling because of the product or what's included or the price or any of those other things. People buy because they're in a buying trance. Now, I like to use the word state because the word trance kind of freaks people out a little bit, right? People buy when they're in a buying state. You get somebody in a buying state, they will buy something they don't need, something they don't want. We've all done it before, haven't we? It's called an impulse buy. You get it home later and you're like, what the hell did I buy this for? Because you were in a buying state. It didn't matter what you bought, you just bought it, okay? When a person's in a buying state, they'll buy almost anything. If a person's not in a buying state, they're not buying. And guess what state people are in when you meet them? Not a buying state. Because what kind of states can people be in? They can be in a vegging out state, a tired state, a bored state. They can be in an indifferent state, an annoyed state, a distracted state. I don't know what happened to my font there. They can feel like they're lacking control in their life. They can be frustrated. They can be in all of these states. You don't know. When a person starts reading your copy, you have no idea what state they're in, but most of us try to get them to buy. What we have to do is move them from the state they're in to the buying state, and that's when we make the offer. That's what every great webinar does, what every great piece of copy does. It's kind of that missing ingredient that most people don't get. When they learn how to write copy and they're like, I understand the formula for copy, why isn't my stuff converting? A lot of times it's because of this, right? So what you have to do is realize most people aren't going to be in a buying state when you meet them. They're going to be in some other state like frustrated. And what you have to do is you've got to figure out a story that will connect from the frustrated state to the buying state. That's the purpose of the story, is to move them from one state to another. Does this make sense? Okay? All great stories do this. The hero's journey is really the beginning of the hero's journey is meeting people in the state that they're in, which is you're an average person, you don't believe in yourself that much, right? You don't have much adventure in your life. That's where the story connects with us. And then once it connects, it then leads us, right? That's called pacing and leading. Anybody ever takes an NLP class, is one of the first things they're going to talk about is pacing and leading. Pace people where they're, and you know what, I get a lot of people like, I've been studying NLP for 20 years. I don't know, what does pacing mean? That's what it means. It means matching them in the state that they're already in. Meet them where they are, okay? Your story must relate to the prospect's current state in some way or another, even if only subconsciously, and sometimes especially subconsciously. I'll give an example of that. A lot of brand new hypnotherapists, when they learn about telling metaphors, instead of hypnotizing people overtly, they learn how to tell what we call metaphors or stories to change people. And a lot of brand new hypnotherapists will be like, oh, I've got a weight loss client. I'm going to tell him a story about a squirrel who every day the squirrel goes out and just eats so many nuts and stuffs himself full of nuts. And this squirrel's fat now. And another squirrel said to the squirrel, stop eating so many nuts, you're fat. Is that story going to work? No, because you know what people are going to do? They're going to go, oh, I get it. I'm the fucking squirrel. Fuck you, right? It's too conscious. We got to learn how to tell stories that are not so consciously connected. All right? So your story can connect with the client in several ways. Number one, the characters. Obviously, you want your prospect to be a character in the story, not an obvious character. We don't consciously think we're Rocky when we watch the movie Rocky, but we connect with Rocky. Why? Because Rocky has certain things that we feel about ourselves. It can be nouns, like things and settings. It can be challenges. What challenge? Rocky had certain challenges in the movie. The Karate Kid had certain challenges. I watched The Karate Kid when I was a kid. I cried because I was that scrawny kid that was bullied, right? I was that character. It can be actions, different verbs, and it can be outcomes. And this is ultimately what we want, right? The outcome, the story starts where they are, but then leads to an outcome. And in the outcome, when the character triumphs, your client triumphs. And in many ways, that triumph means that you earned a sale. Does that make sense? So, don't start with the why. It's a punchline. It's a great quote that I heard from Alex Mondosian last year. Don't start with the why. It's the punchline. So often people will start with the why. I'm going to add to that. Don't even end with the why. Don't be like He-Man and tell them the moral of the story at the end of the metaphor. Let the unconscious mind make the connection. It'll shift their state. Okay? Important. The more likely it is that your subject might reject the message of the story, the more important it should be unconscious. Right? The more subconscious and subtle the story should be. So if you're dealing with somebody that's going to be really resistant to you, you want the story to be seemingly not connected at all. But the unconscious mind makes the connections because your unconscious mind is always lateral chunking. Okay? So how do we apply this to sales and marketing? It's all about pacing and leading. Right? We want to meet them where they are in their model of the world, grab them by the hand, and then lead them across the finish line with the story. Right? Great stories meet those people in the model of the world and move them. So how do we map the story? How do we map their journey that they're on to a story that leads them to the right outcome? Number one, you want to ask yourself, what's their present state? What state are they in? Who are they? Right? It's the first thing we always start with copywriting. We don't start with the product. We start with the who. Who are they? How can we speak to them? Who are the characters that are involved in their story? What's the setting? What's the challenge they're having? Why do they have that challenge? And then we want to find out what's the desired state. Now, hopefully that desired state at the end is married to your desired state. They pull out their credit card, they purchase, they click on the buy button, right? They do something, some active cause that you want them to do. They do a favor for you. Your kids take out the trash, whatever it is, right? Those states are married together. Because here's what happens. When we tell stories that are obvious, let's say we have a client, they're saying, I can't afford it. Now, I got to tell you, here in the United States, Kat brought this up yesterday. Here in the United States, if somebody tells you they can't afford it, that's a smokescreen 99% of the time. I can't afford it in the US is not a real objection. Everybody has access to money. If they want it bad enough, like Kat said, they'll sell their freaking car to get it. Okay? So when somebody says, I can't afford it, that's not the real issue. The issue is their mindset. And that, remember, we talked about that guard at the gate, that critical factor? That will just reject any suggestion you give it. So somebody says, I can't afford it. You go, well, put it on a credit card. And the conscious mind goes, nope, that won't work. It just rejects the suggestion. So we got to get past this part of the mind called the critical factor, the critical part of the mind, the part of the mind that gives us objections. How do we do it? It's really simple. Step one, what is this an example of? Step two, what's another example of that? And this is how we come up with stories, right? Find out where they are, what their problem is, and ask, what is that problem an example of? I can't afford it. What is it an example of? My wife won't let me. My husband won't let me. What is that an example of, right? We chunk it up, find out what the bigger issue is, and we chunk it down to something else and find a story that connects those two things together. I'll give you guys all the slides. We'll post it in the WhatsApp group afterwards. And there's a QR code up here where you can download the slides too. Once you opt in, there's 75 upsells. So I'm kidding. No opt-in. Question?
Can you give us an example?
I'm going to give you lots of examples.
For this specifically?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yep. Yep. And so what happens is once we chunk up over that, then we can lead them to the finish line. Anybody remember this right here? I know the Australians didn't have this, unfortunately. Every Australian I've asked, they're like, I don't know what that is. Everybody remember the little engine that could? The golden books. Right? We all think that the golden books were stories. They were not. The golden books was a magical box of hypnotic metaphors that installed values in you as a 2-year-old and 3-year-old child. The little engine that could, the train was you. The hill was a challenge. The behavior the train had in the beginning was this challenge is hard and I'm giving up, which every 2- and 3-year-old wants to do when they meet a challenge. But the little engine that could finds the resources inside themselves. They went from I know I can't to I think I can to I think I can, I think I can, I think I can, I knew I could. So we connect from the default state of a 2-year-old where they are in their trance, in their state, I give up easily, to I have the resources I can overcome, right? And these magical books, and not only these, but I mean many of the other stories that we were told as children, that's all that these were designed to do. We think that they're just entertainment, but they're not. They're training us how to be adults from a very young age. So where do we get stories? Number one, think of stories, incidences or slices of life that had an impact on you. I love to tell stories from my own life. I can tell them very congruently, right? And I have many, many challenges I've overcome in my life. So anytime somebody tells me they have a challenge, I can just go back through my memory banks, think of a challenge that I had where I had to have a similar resource to overcome what they need to overcome, and I tell them that story, right? Second thing you can do is remember stories that other people told you that impacted you. Anybody hear the Tony Robbins video where he talks about the story of Rocky and how Rocky sells his dog in front of a liquor store? Like, go look it up. Tony Robbins is a fantastic storyteller. He's also trained in NLP, and he knows this process. It's not Tony's story, it's Rocky's story. And I think Tony tells it better than Rocky does, right? So you could tell other people's stories. You could develop your own stories. You've got to be careful with this. If you ever take an NLP class, they're going to tell you to make up stories, which in a therapeutic environment, in a clinical environment, when you're working with a client, right? What's the purpose of the story? It's not to convey factual information, it's to help them overcome a mental challenge. But if you're in marketing, that makes you a liar. Right, making up stories is not a good thing in marketing. So be careful with that kind of thing. Right? Milton Erickson, there's a whole book of stories that Milton Erickson made up to tell his clients. It's called My Voice Will Go With You. Fantastic book if you want to know more about this. But that's a totally different context. So I'd say be careful with that. And then read books. Read books like Chicken Soup for the Soul. Read books like My Voice Will Go With You. Books that have stories in them. Collect stories. Right? Very often, the best storyteller in the room is the person who's the most captivating. That's the person who will end up with the crowd around them. That's the person on stage who will be the best speaker, is the best storyteller, right? And it doesn't always have to be your own stories. You can collect them. Now, realize when you tell a story, it will most likely be a once-only performance, right? The next time you tell the story, it won't be the same. I'll give you an example. When my son was about 8 years old, he called home from school, sick, my tummy hurts, right? We brought him home from school. Well, he figured out that's a pretty good trick. So like a few days later, he called home with another, my tummy hurts, right? And then we started to find out he was putting us on. So I told him the story of the boy who cried wolf. Everybody's heard this. By the way, boy who cried wolf is a hypnotic metaphor, right? It's a cautionary tale. And the first time that I told it to him, it had an impact. He didn't know I was talking about him coming home from school or not. It was a story about wolves. But guess what? He stopped calling home sick for a while, right? Took him about a month, but then he called home sick again. His grandma went and picked him up this time because I wouldn't pick him up. And then I told him the story again. And guess what? Yeah, Dad, I know. It's the boy who cried wolf, right? So the story will have an impact one time, right? So that's one of the reasons why you want to have lots of stories. Here's some examples, all right? And I want you to play along with this with me. If a prospect says, I can't afford it, let's take that problem and ask the question, what is I can't afford it an example of? Something they felt was impossible to do. Good. What else? They don't see the value in it yet. What else? I don't think it'll work for me. What else? I'm scared. That's a pretty big chunk up, but yeah, that's a great one, right? What else? I've failed before, right? All of these, this can be, if you chunk up, it's always right? And of course, when you're working face-to-face with somebody, you're really trying to suss out exactly what it is. When you're in writing copy, you have to be a little bit more general. The higher you chunk, the more people you're going to connect with. But here are some examples I came up with. I can't afford it. What is this an example of? Well, it's an example of a lack of resourcefulness. Tony Robbins always says, not a matter of resources, it's a matter of resourcefulness. If a person gets resourceful enough, they can come up with the money, right? So what is another example of that? Comfort zone. Here's a person who's stuck in their comfort zone. What's another example of that? Maybe they're being short-sighted. So these are just 3 examples, but let's laterally chunk them. What's another example of somebody who had a lack of resourcefulness? Well, I love it, or somebody who overcame a lack of resourcefulness, I should say. The founder of Coin. I love this story, and I wish their company had worked out, but there was a guy that figured out he could take credit cards, like one credit card, and he could put all your credit cards on one credit card. And this guy went to every VC firm in California, and they all told him no. Every single person said he couldn't do it. Right? A lot of people would have given up at that point. He went and sold his Mercedes-Benz car, sold his house. He and his wife and his 2 kids moved into an apartment, and he got the money he needed to found the company. Right? Isn't that a great story? Here's a person who was stuck in a lack of resourcefulness. Nobody would give him the money, and he overcame that and founded the company. It's a great story. How about comfort zone? This is one of my favorite stories to tell. When you have somebody who's stuck in the comfort zone, did you know this? Every single morning of a hummingbird's life, as the sun begins to rise and the air begins to warm around it, there is a crucial point in the hummingbird's life. There's a do or die moment. As the hummingbird begins to wake up, and its heartbeat is only about 10 beats per minute, the hummingbird has to begin moving, must begin moving, and must elevate its own heart rate. Otherwise, it dies. Can you imagine every single morning laying there in the cold, how easy it would be to just say, I'm just going to close my eyes for a few more minutes? But no, the hummingbird persists. The hummingbird realizes no matter how comfortable that nest is, there is great adventure on the other side. Isn't that a great story? Now, who would possibly connect, I can't afford it, to the hummingbird story? Nobody would ever connect that consciously, but the unconscious mind does, right? Here's another example. Short-sightedness. How about the story 3 Feet from Gold from the book Think and Grow Rich? Right? Here's a guy who found a vein of gold, bought the land, he bought all of the equipment, moved it onto the land, drilled into the land, and gold came out. And he celebrated like crazy. He went on a party, he spent all the gold because he had this unlimited gold in the ground. And then he came back and turned on the machine again, and nothing came out but dirt. Dejected, he went into town, he sold the land and the machinery for pennies on the dollar, and he went off to become an insurance salesman for the rest of his life. The man he sold it to realized, I don't know anything about the ground. They say there's gold here, but I don't know anything about it. So he went and sought counsel. He hired somebody who knew enough about the land. And when the man came in, he said, well, this is really simple. All you have to do is move the machinery 3 feet. He hit one of the biggest gold veins in history. Pulled out gold for years, right? Isn't that a great story? One of my favorite ones, 3 Feet from Gold. Love that story. Here's another example. We get this one all the time. My spouse won't let me buy that. I'll need to talk to my spouse. Anybody hear this one? For most people, it's the most difficult objection to overcome. Because how do you tell somebody, screw your spouse, just give me a credit card, right? You can't. You have to respect it whether you want to or not. Most people don't know how to confront this. All right? What is that example of my spouse won't let me buy that?
Authority objection.
Authority objection? Yeah, good. What else? Their own fear. Right? And here's the funny thing. Most of the time when people say my spouse won't let me, they are projecting their own fear.
Because their spouse isn't even there.
Exactly. The spouse is, but by the way, they believe the spouse won't let them, but it's really about them. It's not about their spouse. It could be a lack of responsibility. Absolutely. Right? These are all great. Yeah?
Or the fear of not being able to persuade their spouse.
A fear of not being able to persuade, or what the repercussions will be maybe, right? Here are my examples I came up with. Number 1, it's an example of fear, right? Number 2, it's an example of lack of confidence. Number 3, it's an example of indecision. Okay? These are just 3 possible things, right? But very often I find these are the 3 main things. Let's chunk those over. What's another example of somebody who overcame fear? Well, how about telling a story about somebody who changed careers to take their dream job? I love to tell my story. I didn't used to tell my personal story, by the way. You should all tell your personal stories. They're the most congruent stories you'll tell. And a lot of people, they tell me, Michael, nobody wants to hear my story. I used to think I had a boring life. I thought I had a boring life until somebody said to me one time, they're like, you should write a book about your life. And I was like, why the hell would anybody read that book? I didn't want to go through it. Like, why would anybody else want to go through it, right? And what I didn't realize at the time was when I tell my story, people in the audience connect with some part of my story that I tell, right? When my friend told me everything's easy for me, it's because he didn't know my story. Once he knew my story, he could see it. We call it, by the way, in the speaker world, we call it your mess to success. We all started out as a mess in one way or another. We usually kind of hide it. Don't hide it. Today, what people really want from you is authenticity. People want you to be real, raw, and authentic with them. They want to know that you messed up. They want to know that you had hard times because it makes it real for them. It makes them understand that if you could do it, they can do it, right? What's another example? This is somebody who changed their career, right? So I tell my story about going from being a computer programmer to a hypnotherapist and then eventually a coach and NLP trainer. I love to tell the story. We have an event. It's a personal development event. We teach NLP for improving people's lives. And I get people say to me, how do you have such a high conversion rate on a high-ticket career offer from a personal development course? Stories. I tell my story about going from my job that I absolutely hated, being a computer programmer. I hated going there. I didn't like what I did. And then I talk about being an NLP practitioner, and I love my job, and I get up on Mondays every morning. I'm so excited to help people. I make so much money, right? That's my mess to success story. It's my hero's journey. They connect with that. But then I tell other stories, too. I tell the story about John Sarno. Anybody know Dr. John Sarno? Amazing story. John Sarno was a back surgeon. Did everything by the book, Western medicine, operated on people for decades. And then one day decided to call his patients, hey, how you doing after the back surgery? Every single person said the pain came back. He couldn't be a back surgeon anymore. He switched his career, started helping people with their mind, releasing back pain through their mind, right? That's another story that I tell somebody leaving their career to start a new career and be happy, right? And I tell 5 or 6 of those stories throughout the weekend. Okay. How about lack of confidence? What's another example of a story of somebody overcoming lack of confidence? Tandem skydiving. First time I went skydiving, I didn't do it myself, right? I found somebody who had my back, somebody who had been through it, somebody who knew what they were doing, somebody I could hire that could take me through those challenges and do it with me so that I could feel safe and secure. Isn't that a great story to tell your clients? One of my favorite stories to tell, or somebody coming indecision, somebody coming to a fork in the road and choosing the path. One of my favorite stories to tell, I don't have the time to tell it here, but the story of Chuck Yeager overcoming the sound barrier. It's one of my favorite stories to tell to overcome the objection of my spouse won't let me. Chuck went up in the X-1 plane, and as he started approaching the sound of, the speed of sound, the whole plane started to shake and shimmy. The screws started to come out of the dashboard. The glass on the instrument started to break, and this voice came over and said, abort, abort. Mission control called him back. It was one of the biggest regrets of Chuck Yeager's life. So he went back, landed the plane in shame, not overcoming that speed barrier record. He went up a second time. Plane started shaking. Everything started going, abort, abort. Again, mission control called him back home. He didn't get to do what he wanted to do. Anybody seeing the lateral chunk here? Who is mission control in the story? The spouse. No. And you know how Chuck broke the sound barrier? They said abort, abort the third time, and he said, mission control, I can't hear you, you're breaking up. And he broke the sound barrier. There's a much more elaborate story there that's fun to tell. 3, client wants to cancel a product or they want to get a refund, right? What's that an example of? Here are mine. Lack of commitment, not seeing the end result, or needing to keep an eye on the goal. Some stories that you could tell. Overcoming those. The Monahan brothers. Look up the story of the Monahan brothers who started Domino's. 2 brothers started the company. Only one brother ended up Domino's. The other brother, a few months in, was sick of the work. So he bought his brother out for the VW van and $500. Right? That's a lack of commitment. That's what we call an away from motivation story. That's a cautionary tale, right? Not seeing the end result. How about the turtle in the hare, right? Sometimes we can go back to stories people know, right? And then needing to keep an eye on the goal. Running a marathon. You know, every marathon runner tells you there's a point where they hit a wall where their body says stop. Around the 12 or 13 mile mark a lot of times. They have to push through that, right? And keep their eye on the goal. Great metaphor I always love to tell, the meeting of Andrew Carnegie and Napoleon Hill. Okay? So here's a real world example I'll give you. I had a client who came to me, Richard. Actually, Richard is one of the reasons why I know Glenn and why Glenn and I are friends today. Richard came to me, and when I met him, I introduced myself to him. I said, typical thing, Richard, what do you do? Richard says, well, I've created an app which you install on an Android device. It doesn't work on Apple right now because Apple doesn't let you mess with the internals of the device, and we're trying to deal with Apple's lawyers about that, but that's a whole different thing. And so you install it on an Android device, and the app pulls the GPS chip in the phone every 5 to 20 seconds, which is configurable because it'll really drain your battery if you do it every 5 seconds. And it determines if the phone's moving, and if the phone is moving, it shuts off the functions of the phone. I'm not exaggerating. That is how he told me his app. And he told me his biggest frustration in business was that he would talk to his ideal customer avatar and tell them what the app was, and they would say, how much is it? And he'd say $5, and they'd say, that's too expensive for an app. Apps are 99 cents. His audience didn't understand what he was selling. I didn't, and I used to be a computer programmer, right? So after working with me, Richard and I went through a VIP day, and we crafted his message. Yeah. And so what happened was, at the end of that, his message became this. Imagine it's the holidays. You're gathered together in a warm, safe place with the people you love. You can hear a game on in the background, hear laughter coming from the other room. You can smell the smell of the food coming from the kitchen and feel the love in the room when somebody says, time to eat. So you walk into the dining room, you sit down in the chair, you look out at the feast in front of you in gratitude. And as your eyes drift up and gaze across the faces of each and every person at that table, they fall in an empty chair. That chair is empty because it was a teenager who was texting while driving. And they're no longer with us. I've created an app that prevents that. I am ending distracted driving for teens. Look at that. I developed this story with him 12 years ago, and every time I tell it, I still get goosebumps, right? Now, his message was so different after that. Not only did he start selling his app to people he talked to, people said, 99 cents, oh my God, how do I put this on my teenager's phone? But he was invited to speak at the Distracted Driving Summit, put on by the United States National Safety, NTSB, whatever that is, with AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile and all the major carriers, to be a keynote speaker at the Distracted Driving Summit 2 years in a row. That's the power of a story, right? Here's another example. This is from one of my pages called The Wealth Imprint. This is one of the things that really lifted the copy. I realized that most people were coming. This is a 30-day program to change your wealth mindset with hypnosis sessions. And I realized a lot of people were skeptical. Can't tell people not to be skeptical. That's talking to the conscious mind. I told a story. It's August 15th, 1998, the last day of the county fair. The smell of popcorn and cotton candy fills my nose as the sound of merry-go-rounds, circus games, and laughing children fill the air. There's an electric charge at the fair as my life is about to take the most astounding turn. One particular vendor has caught my attention. He's selling subconscious influence tapes and saying, step on up, get your tapes for $20. Like most, I'm skeptical, not believing for a moment that these seemingly silly recordings he's selling could affect my subconscious mind. But I was amused. I thought, I just have to know what's on these tapes. I bought the tapes out of nothing but sheer curiosity. Isn't it interesting how sheer curiosity can sometimes drive you forward toward the most rewarding choices in life, or changes in life? Although these recordings seemed ordinary, the contents were completely extraordinary, right? So there's a story, pacing and leading. So here are some tips for becoming a master storyteller. Number one, have a purpose for telling the story. If it's your story, tell it from first person. Use all 5 senses in your storytelling. Notice how I talked about hearing a game in the background, smelling the food, feeling the sights, sounds, feelings, and internal dialogue, self-talk. Use hypnotic language. You can reference my book, Influence to Profit, for that. I'll give you a copy of that for free. Create and use suspense. Suspense is very powerful in the stories. And all suspense is just taking a tense moment and stretching it out as long as possible in the story. Often the best time to start a story is not at the beginning, but somewhere in the middle, where the suspense is, and then backfill the story. Create a powerful internal reality for people, right? You want people to enter the story so they kind of, you know how it is when you hear a good story, you kind of lose reality and you enter the story. And if necessary, make sure there's no conscious connection. My final thing is this, really quickly. One ninja thing that you can do is what's called nested loops. Everybody's heard of open loops, right? Nested loops are where you do that over and over and over again. You cut a story off before you finish it, then you tell another one. Cut it off before you finish it, tell another one, cut it off. And then in the middle is where you put your content, like speaking on stage. And then when you're done, you wrap it up, okay? So you can do this to close a sale, to save a sale, to increase pay in fulls, to inspire people, to raise your kids, to lead, to start a movement, and really anywhere that you want to communicate effectively, right? So there I was, standing on that, or having lunch with my friend, and he said, I thought you were bullshit. And he said, but then I heard you tell your story. And he goes, I know that story because I was there. I knew you when you were there. And I heard you tell that story, and it was so real and so authentic. He goes, you didn't know this about me, but I was hooked on heroin. And he said, when you told that story, and I heard what you overcame in your life and saw where you are now, and I realized you weren't full of shit, he said, I picked up my heroin and I flushed it down the toilet, and I've never touched heroin since then. A story that I wasn't even there personally to tell, that he heard on a recording. Stories are so powerful. And when I finished that speech, 40 people in the room, even though I'd only been asked 15 minutes earlier to step up on that stage, and even though I didn't have an offer or an order form, 10 of those 40 people walked up to me and said, I want to work with you. 2 of those people became five-figure, like $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 clients. One of those people, by the way, is one of the most successful NLP trainers out there. He trains NLP all over the world for Success Resources. He spoke in front of 200,000 people, all because I told my story that day. And when I told my best friend Eugene what happened, he looked at me, he said 6 words that changed my life forever. He said, you have to tell that story. I said, why would I tell that story to people? People don't care about my life. Nobody wants to hear my sob story. And he said, Michael, you don't understand. People can't connect with you the way you are right now. They look at you and they see how good you are because you have 20 years of experience doing this. They need to know where you came from. They need to hear who you are. That changed my life forever. Because not only was I able to turn something that was pain for me, what I like to call from being a victim to being a victor, but I was able to do that for other people as well because other people could see themselves in my story. So tell stories. You're not going to be good at it in the beginning. I wasn't. You're going to get better and better the more you practice. So practice, practice, practice. Tell lots and lots of stories. Get out there and change people's lives and hopefully make a lot more money doing it. So my gift for you, my book, if you want to scan that code, you can get it. I'll also put the link inside the WhatsApp. That's my Influence to Profit book. It talks a lot about the hypnotic language and everything else. Not an opt-in. And if you want the slides, there's the QR code for it right there. You can download the slides. Thank you so much, everybody.